Today we will take a look at the most terrifying nuclear war close calls in history, the Suez Crisis. While British and French forces attacked Egypt because they laid claim to the Suez Canal, the USSR warned they were considering non-nuclear attacks on London and Paris if they didn't stop. On the night of November 5, 1956, NORAD received numerous alerts that included unidentified aircrafts were detected over Turkey. 100 Soviet MiGs were flying over Syria. A British bomber had been brought down over Syria, and a Soviet fleet was on the move in Turkey. The US thought the Soviets weren't messing around this time and worried a NATO nuclear strike against Russia could soon follow, and that this could be the start of something big. But it later turned out that the unidentified aircraft over Turkey was just a group of swans. The Soviet fighters were escorting the Syrian president home from Moscow. The British bomber was down because of mechanical issues, and the Soviet fleet was just performing scheduled routine exercises. Moonrise over Norway. Radar equipment in Thule, Greenland, detected dozens of Soviet missiles launched for the United States. NORAD went on high alert, but the leaders found something that caused them to doubt the legitimacy of the alerts. During the supposed attack, the Soviet leader was in New York. So it didn't make sense to attack. It turns out the radar had misinterpreted a Moonrise over Norway for missiles. That radar must have been ass. Goldsboro B-52 crash. A B-52G, which was carrying 2 thermonuclear bombs, had an aerial refueling scheduled when the refuelers told them they had a leak. They were informed by ground control to keep doing circles in the air to empty the fuel tank. But unbeknownst to them, the leak had worsened and they had lost 37,000 pounds of fuel in 3 minutes. They were informed to land immediately at Seymour Johnson Air Force Base. When the aircraft reached 10,000 feet on the descent, the aircraft lost control. An entire wing of the aircraft was apparently lost. The pilot in command, Major Walter Scott Tulloch, ordered the crew to abandon the aircraft. All 8 men ejected the plane or bailed out through a hatch. The 2 bombs separated from the aircraft before it crashed. The first bomb flung out of the aircraft at 9,000 feet above ground. The parachutes on the bomb opened, which helped it not crash into the earth. It was discovered in an upright position, with its parachute hanging on adjacent trees, causing little damage to its surroundings. The second bomb, on the other hand, ended up causing a lot more trouble. It was separated from the aircraft when it was between 5,000 and 2,000 feet above ground. Because the weapon was released at such a low altitude, its parachute failed to open, which caused it collide with the ground at a high speed. The impact resulted in a pretty huge crater which measured 5 feet deep and 9 feet in diameter. But luckily, no nuclear detonation occurred. Bomb number 2 had broken into pieces on impact, and technicians spent several days trying to recover its pieces. 5 of the 8 crew members landed safely after ejecting. 1 guy died because he didn't survive his parachute landing, and 2 other crew members also didn't survive, for reasons not mentioned during my research. A road marker was erected at the crash site in 2012. Contact lost to NORAD. The communications link between Strategic Air Command and NORAD went dead. As a result, they lost contact with early warning radar systems in Thule, Greenland. When a SAC officer tried to call NORAD headquarters, the line was dead. The low probability of both locations losing communication at the same time led them to believe that an attack was taking place. SAC's entire alert force was ordered to prepare for takeoff. But fortunately, at the time, a US bomber was circling over Thule and informed that there was no attack and the alert was called off. It turned out that the supposedly independent communication lines actually all traveled through the same relay station in Colorado. On that particular evening, a motor at the relay station had overheated, dropping all communication. Cuban Missile Crisis. Unlike other events on the list, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a direct confrontation between US and Soviet Union. And it was the closest we came to the Cold War breaking into an all-out nuclear war. It all started when an American U-2 spy plane saw nuclear missile sites being built by the Soviet Union on the island of Cuba. President Kennedy didn't want the Soviets in Cuba to know that he had discovered the missiles, so he set a secret meeting with his advisors and discussed the problem for several days. Kennedy was advised to carry out an airstrike on Cuban soil to compromise Soviet missile supplies, followed by the invasion of the Cuban mainland. But he chose a less aggressive course in order to avoid a declaration of war. On the 22nd of October, Kennedy ordered a naval blockade to prevent further missile deliveries and called it a quarantine, not a blockade. He was trying everything he could to not escalate the situation. He demanded the removal of missiles already there and the destruction of the sites. No one knew how the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev would respond to the naval blockade and U.S. demands. But both leaders knew the world, wrecking earth-shattering, blasting back to the Stone Age kind of possibility of a nuclear war. So they agreed to a deal in which the Soviets would dismantle their offensive weapons in Cuba for a pledge that the U.S. would not invade Cuba. The U.S. had also secretly agreed to remove their missiles from Turkey. The tensions between the two superpowers cooled down a bit after the incident, and they even built a direct communication line. Events during the Cuban Missile Crisis. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, a number of events took place, which could have triggered the war, even when the big boys were negotiating a deal. Let's take a look at them in chronological order. During the era, B-52 bombers, armed with nuclear weapons, were in air at all times to prevent being destroyed on the ground in a surprise attack. The Russian interceptor bases were thought to have a radius of 400 miles to prevent these planes from getting too close. But on this day, the crew on one of the B-52s made a critical error. They were 20 degrees off course and within 300 miles of one of the suspected interceptor bases. It's unclear why the Russians didn't react. But the U.S. did alter the course after that particular route, but only after the Cuban Missile Crisis ended. The U.S. military forces had been put on high alert because they expected sabotage operations from Soviets before any nuclear first strike. At midnight, a guard at Duluth Sector Direction Center saw a figure climbing the security fence. He shot at it and activated the sabotage alarm, which set off alarms at all the bases in the region. However, at Volk Field in Wisconsin, miswired alarms caused the klaxon alarm to sound instead, that ordered takeoff of nuclear-armed F-106A interceptors. Before the planes were able to take off, the base commander contacted Duluth and learned of the error. An officer rushed onto the runway in his car, flashing his lights and signaling the planes to stop just in time. The intruder was discovered to be a bear. October 27. This may be the closest call of all. 11 U.S. Navy destroyers and the USS Randolph aircraft carrier had cornered a Soviet B-59 submarine near Cuba, which was outside U.S. quarantine area and in international waters. What they didn't know was that the temperature on board had risen past 45 degrees Celsius as the submarine's batteries were running out and the air conditioning had stopped. On the verge of carbon dioxide poisoning, many crew members fainted. Then, the Americans started dropping small depth charges, which were merely meant to force them to surface and leave. What the Americans also didn't know was that the B-59 crew had a nuclear torpedo, and they were allowed to launch it without clearing with Moscow. The crew had no contact with Moscow for days and didn't know whether World War III had already begun. Captain Savitsky decided to launch the nuclear torpedo. Valentin Grigorievich, the torpedo officer, exclaimed, "We will die, but we will sink them all. We will not disgrace our Navy." But one of the officers on board, Vasily Arkhipov, said no. And so only one man stood between the 10-kiloton nuclear torpedo and the American fleet. He convinced the captain to calm down, surface, and make contact with Moscow for new orders. Archipov's decision was perhaps the single most valuable contribution to humanity in modern history. Historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. later noted that this was not only the most dangerous moment of the Cold War, it was the most dangerous moment in human history. Thule Accident. A B-52 bomber carrying 4 thermonuclear bombs was on Chrome Dome alert mission when suddenly the cabin caught fire. They tried to make an emergency landing but realized they didn't have enough time, so they ended up ejecting from the plane. 6 crew members ejected safely, but one who didn't have an ejection seat died while trying to bail out. The plane crashed into the ice 7 miles offshore. The fuel and conventional explosives blew up, But thankfully, there wasn't a nuclear explosion. If the nuclear component had exploded, the lack of communication from the crew would have led SAC to assume that the explosion had been an attack. The crash also caused radioactive contamination of the area, which the US had to clean up. Simulated Soviet attack on the 11 November 1979. The US Missile Warning Center were horrified when they saw their displays light up with the ultimate horror. The Soviet Union had launched 250 ballistic missiles with a trajectory for the United States. NORAD notified national security that a decision to retaliate would need to be made by the president within 3 to 7 minutes. Then the number of incoming missiles increased to 2,200. Within minutes, US intercontinental ballistic missile crews were put on highest alert. Nuclear bombers prepared for takeoff, and the National Emergency Airborne Command Post, the plane designed to allow the US president to maintain control in case of an attack, took off, but without the president on board. 1 minute passed, and then 2. The entire US silently waited. Soldiers ready to take off. Submarines ready to blast their nukes. Jim, unaware he's about to be vaporized, taking a dump. Then, 6 minutes passed, and no attacks were confirmed. Everyone took a sigh of relief and decided no immediate action was necessary. They found out later that a training tape was inserted mistakenly into an operational computer, and it contained the scenario for a large-scale nuclear attack. Soviet Union detects incoming missiles. This event occurred during a period of high tension between the US and Soviet Union due to the US military buildup in the early 1980s and President Ronald Reagan's shit-talking to the Soviets. Earlier in the month, the Soviets had shot down a Korean passenger plane that strayed into its airspace, killing almost 300 people. On 26 September 1983, Soviet satellite-based early warning system detected the launch of an ICBM from the US. The Soviets' policy was that if any incoming missiles were detected, they would immediately retaliate with their own, no questions asked. But Stanislav Petrov, the officer on duty at the time, was skeptical of the readings. He reasoned that if it were a genuine first attack, the US would launch hundreds of ICBMs, not just one. The radar then showed 4 more missiles headed for the USSR, but he dismissed these 2 as a glitch. Petrov was right, and his decision probably saved millions of lives. Later investigations found out that the satellite had been fooled by sun reflecting on the top of clouds, which it interpreted as missile launches. Soviets misinterpret nuclear war games. Tensions were high between NATO and Soviet Union at the time. Exercise Able Archer was an annual exercise by NATO forces in Europe which practiced transition from conventional operations to chemical, nuclear, and wartime operations. But the Able Archer of 1983 is considered to be one of the closest moments the world came to nuclear war. The goal of the exercise, like previous years, was to simulate a period of conflict escalation. But this year, they introduced several new elements, which were a new format of coded communication, radio silences, and the heads of government were playing along too. This triggered extreme alarm on the Soviet side, where analysts feared that it was a cover for an actual nuclear attack. Soviets placed their missiles on high alert and readied for launch. The climax came on the morning of November 11th when the Soviets intercepted a NATO message saying that US nuclear missiles had been launched against them, but they found out later that it was just part of the simulation. It is crazy to imagine what might have happened if another event such as the false alarm of 26 September 1983 had randomly occurred on the same day. Norwegian rockets mistaken for ICBM. After the Cold War ended, Norwegian and American scientists launched a rocket off the coast of Norway. The rocket eventually reached an altitude of 903 miles, resembling a US submarine-launched Trident missile. Russian radars picked up the launch, and fearing that it could be the start of a larger attack, their forces quickly went on full alert. The incident got so serious that a briefcase containing nuclear launch codes was taken to Russian President Boris Yeltsin. The Russian satellites monitoring US missile fields didn't detect any additional launches, and it was declared a false alarm. The rocket that was launched was for studying the aurora. Norway had notified Russia of the launch, but the message didn't seem to have reached the correct personnel.
Legalize nuclear bombs.